Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming this evening. My name is Karen Campbell, and I'm the Phil Wilson Curator of Contemporary Art here at Joslyn Art Museum. And I am thrilled to welcome you to our fourth annual Graham and Sally Lusk Lecture. So a bit about the lecture series, and then I'll introduce this evening's esteemed speaker. The Graham and Sally Lusk Lecture invites acclaimed artists, scholars, and visionary thinkers in the field of art and creativity to engage and inspire audiences who wish to better understand and appreciate art from around the world and throughout time. The series was created through an estate gift from Graham Lusk, Ph.D., and honors both Graham and Sally's ongoing commitment, I should say, to Joslyn Art Museum. So thank you very much to the Lusks for their generosity. So tonight, I am really excited to have Christopher Knight here to speak. Christopher is art critic for the Los Angeles Times, and when I reached out to him initially about this talk, he said, you know, I don't do a lot of these kinds of talks, and my work is very busy, but I really respect Ed and his work, so if I'm going to talk about an artist, it's going to be Ed. So I did a little dance in my office, and then sent the email that said, yes, Christopher will come and speak. So Christopher is a three-time finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. He was awarded the prize for criticism in 1991, 2001, and 2007. He received the Frank Jewett Mather Award for distinction in art criticism from the College Art Association in 1997, which made him the first journalist in about 25 years to win that award. He's appeared on multiple media outlets, including 60 Minutes on CBS, NewsHour on PBS, Morning Edition, and All Things Considered, two of my favorites, on NPR, as well on CNN. He was also featured in the 2009 documentary, The Art of Ed Ruscha, which was about the controversial relocation of the Barnes Foundation's art collection in Philadelphia. So we're thrilled to have Christopher here this evening. One quick note, there will be a question and answer session afterward, so we'll have some time for that. If you would wait for a microphone to come your way, we'd really appreciate it because we are recording this event, and we'd love to capture your questions and the responses from Christopher on that recording. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome to the stage Mr. Christopher Knight.
Thanks for that very nice, overly generous introduction. I'm very happy to be here this evening, and not just because this afternoon in Los Angeles there was a 5.3 earthquake, which apparently didn't do much in the way of damage, but really annoyed my dog. As Karen said, I'm happy to be here because anywhere there's an Ed Ruscha show, I'm happy to be. The occasion for this talk is the exhibition of Ruscha's paintings, photographs, and graphic work currently in the museum's galleries. And the occasion for that exhibition is to remedy a somewhat surprising oversight. Oof. As you all undoubtedly know, Ruscha was born in Omaha in 1937, a little over a week before Christmas. But to my knowledge, the most important artist Nebraska has yet produced, an artist with a reputation both national and international, has never had a major museum exhibition here before now. And this fine show remedies that oversight. So, in recognition of that happy news, which is based on the artist's biography, let me begin tonight with just one or two small observations on the story of Ruscha's life. In 1937, when he was born, several other memorable things happened in the United States. Here's a little sample. The Great Depression was in its 8th grinding year, and Franklin Roosevelt was being sworn in for a second term as president. The brand new Social Security program began to collect payroll taxes in anticipation of making its first benefit payments to retired American citizens. The British artist David Hockney, who would move to Los Angeles at the age of 27, becoming a pop art colleague of Ruscha's, was born in Bradford, England. Closer to home, the Ohio River crested at between 57 and 72 feet in a devastating flood that left 1 million people homeless in a region stretching from Pittsburgh to Cairo, Illinois. The giant German Zeppelin Hindenburg burst into flames and crashed to the ground as it attempted to dock with a mooring mast at Lakehurst Naval Air Station in New Jersey. In other transportation news, the Golden Gate Bridge opened, connecting the city of San Francisco with Marin County to the north. And last, but certainly not least for our story, on May 11th, a canned ham product by Hormel, a meat packer near Minneapolis, registered the name Spam as a trademark. The first can of Spam was introduced to the public on July 5, immediately after Independence Day. Now, the arrival of Spam on the consumer stage might not, at first glance, seem to be that big a deal, but it was. Spam was the only canned meat on the market that needed no refrigeration, and it was inexpensive, made from pork shoulder rather than pork hindquarters, which constitutes an actual ham. The price point made it attractive to Depression America shoppers, and the timing turned out to be fortuitous. Within 3 years, the difficulty of delivering fresh meat to the front during World War II saw Spam become a ubiquitous part of the US soldiers' diet. Soldiers variously referred to it as, quote, ham that did not pass its physical, or meatloaf without the basic training. Over 150 million pounds of Spam were purchased by the US military before the end of the war. And it also helped keep America's allies in Great Britain and the Soviet Union afloat. Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader who was present at the gruesome and seemingly interminable siege of Stalingrad, a pivotal battle in the war that lasted 5 months, 1 week, and 3 days, later said, quote, without Spam, we would not have been able to feed our army. The Battle of Stalingrad, in which close to 2 million people died, is often regarded as the longest, bloodiest battle in the history of warfare. During World War II and the occupations that followed, Spam was introduced into Guam, Hawaii, Okinawa, the Philippines, and other islands in the Pacific. My dad, who was stationed during the war as a supply sergeant in several of those Pacific places, once told me that Spam became a sought-after item for barter with the locals. The demand was that high. And my husband, who was born and raised in Manila, capital of the Philippines, says that by the 1950s, Spam was a great treat when fried up on the breakfast menu at home. It had acquired a distinct cachet as a glamorous imported food. By 1959, 1 billion cans had been sold around the world. Now, Ed Ruscha had a thing for Spam too. This is actual size, arguably his first flat-out masterpiece. He painted it in 1962 when he was just 25. It shows the manufactured product's logo, curvy, bright yellow letters against a dark indigo blue background in the painting's top register. Beneath it, the image of a can of Spam trailing yellow flames shoots across a barren field of canvas flecked with drips and splatters of blue paint, like a comet or a shooting star streaking across the sky. Those flames also recall the custom paint job on a Chevy or Oldsmobile hot rod. Ruscha had been living in LA for about 6 years by the time he painted actual size, and the rise of car culture was well underway as a defining feature of Southern California. Flames put the heat in a hot rod, denoting glamour and speed. 1962 was also the year that an unknown artist from New York had his very first solo exhibition in an art gallery, a gallery not in New York, but in Los Angeles. The Ferris Gallery on La Cienega Boulevard showed 32 paintings of Campbell's soup cans by Andy Warhol. The small canvases were set up on a shelf that ringed the room. They were like ordinary mass-produced products in a grocery store. Just 2 of them sold. Ruscha and Warhol had one important thing in common. Both had extensive training and substantial backgrounds in commercial art and graphic design. Warhol had graduated from Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh and had become one of the most successful commercial artists on Madison Avenue. His annual salary at the time of his Campbell's soup can debut was equivalent to $750,000 today. The 2 paintings he sold brought $100 each. Ruscha, who was almost 10 years younger, was certainly not at that level. But when he moved from the Midwest to the West Coast in 1956, he enrolled at the Chouinard Art Institute, one of the city's oldest art schools, it's now called Cal Arts, to study in the commercial graphic design program. A year later, while he was still a student at Chouinard, he came across a reproduction in Print Magazine, a quarterly journal that chronicled the booming fields of advertising and commercial graphic design in the era of Mad Men. Print Magazine was the Bible of the trade, so it paid attention to a wide variety of cultural interests, including art. If you look closely at the Print Magazine cover on the right, the one that's a building with windows, it's signed in the lower right by the artist Ben Shahn. The reproduction that Ruscha stumbled on was an eccentric, mixed media work by a young New York artist named Jasper Johns. Target with 4 faces is exactly what the title says it is. The target is a series of concentric blue and yellow rings on a red field. This red, yellow, blue color scheme is of course composed of the 3 primary colors, the building blocks through which the entire spectrum could be built in the printing process. It's also a scheme whose artistic pedigree ranged from Mondrian to Joseph Albers. The target is painted in oil mixed with beeswax over a ground of collaged newsprint, which gives it a very tactile surface that appeals to the sense of touch. At the same time, the wax visually embalms the brushstrokes with which the image is made. So the result is double-edged. The target is one step removed. It's a picture of a target, while at the very same time, it's an actual target. The shape, size, and design are what you might find in any sporting goods store. You could actually hang Jasper John's target on the wall of your den and really use it for a game of darts. Perhaps the most famous statement about Jasper John's subject matter, targets, the alphabet, numbers, maps, is that he only wanted to paint flat, 2-dimensional subjects that are, quote, things the mind already knows. Things like spam. You already know what a number 3 looks like, or the shape of the United States, or a target. So your eye and mind can focus in on other, less expected qualities. As subject matter, a target is about 2 fundamental things. It's about the act of looking and aiming. In a lidded box across the top, Johns inserted 4 plaster casts of the bottom half of a man's face. These casts were all made from a single model, but all of them are slightly different, made at separate times. Notably, the 4 faces are sliced off just below the eyes. The target might be about looking and aiming, but these faces are unseeing. What Johns invokes with these plaster casts are a person's other senses: smell with the nose, sound and taste through the mouth. He brings these senses into tension with the painter's traditional sensory appeals to sight and touch. So let's go back now from Jasper John's shooting target to Ed Ruscha's shooting can of Spam. A can of Spam is certainly something the mind in 1962 would indeed already know, and quite well, even if the label might not immediately register as being a mostly red, yellow, and blue composition. But what about the composition of Ruscha's painting, which juxtaposes an average label from a can down below with the name in big, booming letters up above? This painting is 6 feet tall, which is the average height of a standing man, and just over 5.5 feet wide. That's its actual size, although you can't really tell from looking at a photograph. And remember, the title of the painting is not Spam or Still Life or Shooting Star. The title of the painting is Actual Size. What is the actual size of Spam? Is it the size of the can sitting on a supermarket shelf? Is it the size of the name recognition in the consciousness of the consumer? That is, the size of the thing the mind already knows. In the painting, is it the label below or the blaring word above? Or is it the painting as an object in itself? For Ruscha's art, it is crucial to understand that words simply do not have any fixed size. Language comes in large, medium, and small, including the fine print, but only depending on the focus. It is elastic and malleable. Language is an environment, and it shapes the world in which we live. The actual size is whatever an artist deems it to be on the canvas in front of him. Small here, big there, a graphic design question in the fictional field of an autonomous object called a work of art. One of my favorite features of Ruscha's painting is those blue drips, the pigment that rains down as if from the big flat field of blue color up above. Those drips are classic abstract expressionist style, a messiness that might not pass muster in a carefully controlled graphic design class at school, but something that had come to signify the free-spirited independence of the all-American artist, ever since Jackson Pollock began to make drip paintings in the wake of World War II, and Willem de Kooning started to crash brushstrokes together like cars in a crack-up on the highway. Drip paintings were a sign of art with a capital A, especially modern American art, as distinguished from what happened before it in Europe. Ruscha painted a whole drip painting in 1966, titled Annie, Poured from Maple Syrup. Nothing is drippier than maple syrup, which here spells out the name of Little Orphan Annie, iconic child of the Great Depression, just like Ed Ruscha. And I'll bet Little Orphan Annie also ate Spam. Those drips in Ruscha's actual size are every bit as much a label as the can of Spam blazing through, or the logo word emblazoned across the top. And in all three cases, the picture, the word, and the abstraction, they are not fragments of nature, but instead are elements manufactured artificially. Here are some more word environments manufactured artificially, which Ruscha offered up in paintings that wear their design emphasis on their sleeve. This is large Trademark with 8 spotlights, sometimes just called 20th Century Fox, from 1962. The colors in this painting are red, yellow, and blue, the primaries. Or, if you want to look at it another way, red, white, and blue, plus lights. There's a Renaissance vanishing point. It starts at the lower right-hand edge. It doesn't really show up in this slide, but the pencil lines from that lower right corner up to the letters in the 20th Century Fox sign, the pencil lines are actually in the painting, and they're left there, they're prominent in the painting. and can be seen quite clearly. So the illusionism of that blaring sign is held in tension with the flatness of all the color in the painting. The painting is 11 feet wide and 5.5 feet tall, which is close to the rectangular dimensions of a CinemaScope movie screen. CinemaScope was the standard, well, not standard, it was a new format for movies that began in 1953 and held its popularity until the mid-1960s. And it was called CinemaScope because it changed the aspect ratio of the screen. The aspect ratio is the ratio of the width of the screen to its height. The aspect ratio of a standard full-screen movie before that was 1.37 to 1, but CinemaScope changed the aspect ratio to 2.3 to 1, 11 feet by 5.5 feet. The wide shape of the painting also mimics the wide horizontal dimensions of a billboard. It derives from advertising. Here's a still from an old movie, a very old movie, in fact, one of the very first movies, Louis Lumiere's L'arrivée d'un train à la Ciotat, the arrival of a train at La Ciotat, a town on the Mediterranean in the south of France. It's just south of Aix-en-Provence, where Cézanne lived. It was made in 1896. The film is less than a minute long, and in it, nothing happens. As far as a dramatic narrative goes, a train pulls into the station, that's it, movie's over. It's a very banal bit of everyday life. The train pulled into the station several times a day, 7 days a week, every day of the month. It was made with a stationary camera set up on a tripod looking down the tracks, which is the way in which one tends to explain how Renaissance perspective works. It creates the illusion of depth by lines appearing to converge at a vanishing point, even though the mind already knows that those tracks are not going to come together. The camera was on a stationary tripod, so the frame for the image is static. It's like a painting, except what's inside it moves. Ruscha has said that these images of trains pulling into a station, including this one, were indeed an influence on his design style. There's also an apocryphal tale that when the Lumiere film was first shown in Paris in the theater and the train began to pull into the station, people sitting out in the audience screamed and ran out of the theater thinking they were going to be killed. I want to emphasize it's an apocryphal tale. It didn't really happen. But it's also part of the mythology that tends to surround image making. This is Standard Station, Amarillo, Texas, 1963. It's the very same graphic design emphasis as 20th Century Fox, the same red, white, and blue color scheme, plus Klieg lights. The red, white, and blue color scheme, I think, is really interesting since it turns up in so many of these works. At the time that this was made, there was a question in the mind of critics, historians, museum curators, and artists, and that is, what is American about American art? How could American art be distinguished from the modernist art that had preceded it in Europe? In 1963, Gene Lippmann at the Whitney Museum of American Art organized an exhibition, What is American in American Art? Clement Greenberg, the powerful critic in New York, in 1955 wrote a very influential essay called American Type Painting, in which he attempted to distinguish the difference between American and European modernism. And it was republished in a collection of his critical essays called Art and Culture, which appeared in 1961. So in the 60s, there was There was a whole lot of give and take, shall we say, about the question of Americanism in art, whether it was significant, whether it even existed. Ruscha had worked as a commercial layout artist after his 1960 graduation from Chenard. He went to work immediately in LA for the largest advertising agency in town. I'm showing you this, this cover of Art Forum and the prior slide because the printed and written material around art at the period, I think, is also influential in how Ed began to approach painting. He did layout design for Art Forum magazine, which was a new magazine that began in San Francisco in 1961. In 1962, it moved on to LA, and by late 1964, 1965, it had relocated to New York. Ed was doing layout for the magazine, and the most unusual thing about Art Forum, aside from the impenetrable writing inside, is that the format of the magazine is atypical. It's not a vertical rectangle, it's a square. The magazine is a square, which makes it sort of unwieldy on the bookshelf, but when you open that square up, and you have two squares side by side, what you have is a billboard for art. Ed was bringing commercial design techniques into painting, not just commercial subject matter. This is Norm's La Cienega on Fire from 1964, another red, white, and blue painting. This one has a little beige in it because so does the building. It's based on an actual building. Norm's is a chain of all-night coffee shops. The architectural style is known as Googie architecture, which basically means it's a very simple post and beam with a very big sign, so that the building itself acts as a billboard to attract traffic passing by in automobiles to pull into the all-night coffee shop. The motto at Norm's, which you would see when you go in the little lobby, says, "Welcome to Norm's, where life happens 24/7. One of the interesting things about this particular Norm's is that in its post and beam style, it's not a flat roof. The roof is on an angle. So it makes the vanishing point, the illusion of a vanishing point that is in these early paintings, it makes it into an actual space. It's an actual architectural place, that illusionistic design style. And not by accident, this particular Norm's that you see in the photograph on the right was across the street from the Ferris Gallery, where Warhol had had that first Campbell Soup show and where Ed had his first exhibition and began to show regularly. Upstairs from the Ferris Gallery were the offices of Art Forum magazine. Ruscha was doing what an avant-garde artist was supposed to do. He was setting norms on fire. He was destroying norms to make a space for something new to emerge. There's an irony in this, because if that's what an avant-garde artist is supposed to do, it's a norm. That kind of double-edged question is in a lot of Ed's work. If you're going to burn down norms, it is necessary to also burn down standards. Standards and norms have got to go. And if you're going to burn down standards and norms of art, you might as well burn down the entire art museum. This is Los Angeles County Museum of Art on Fire, which began in 1965, the year that the building opened, and then he set it aside for actually a couple of years. He didn't finish it till 1968. The building was built in '65, as I say. It was brand new. It was designed by an architect named William Pereira, who was making basically Southern California's version of Manhattan's Lincoln Center. There are 3 temples on a raised plaza. This one's sitting in a pool of water. This is a postcard from when the building opened. And the design of the building was widely disparaged when it opened as being too flashy and gauche and inappropriate. The building to the left is the Amundsen building, which is for the museum's permanent collection. The building in the center was then called the Litton Building. That's where temporary exhibitions were held. And the building on the right was the Bing Auditorium, an auditorium like this one. And you arrived on across that bridge over the pool and up the stairs, and could decide which building you were going into. Now, this is not a word environment like the Standard Station or the 20th Century Fox sign. But it is an environment dominated by a sign. The art museum as a sign of a culture's values. LA was the second largest city in America, having overtaken Chicago for that title in the early 1960s, but it had not had a civic art museum before. This one was brand new. So the city of Los Angeles, which had become a symbol for the future, was getting a cultural past. So Ed torched it. I love the color in this painting. It sort of starts as this weird kind of chartreuse in the upper left-hand corner, closest to the flames and the smoke, and then it slides through this muddiness as it angles down across the canvas to the lower right corner, where it becomes the color of smoke. The landscape in which this museum sits is an abstract painting. It's a no place of very queasy color that I now think of as smog. There is a very strange far space, which is just kind of out there. It has no horizon. It just continues on. And there's a near space in which the building floats, and there is nothing in between. The color goes on a diagonal from the upper left to the lower right, while the building and the street out front, which is Wilshire Boulevard, the main thoroughfare that's a kind of spine for the city of Los Angeles, goes in the opposite direction. And it's a little hard to tell, but if you follow the roof lines, the orthogonal roof lines on the Bing, the Litton, and the Amundsen, if you follow those roof lines to where the vanishing point would be, they don't arrive at the same single vanishing point. The orthogonal lines are slightly askew. They don't quite match up. There's a very subtle but distinct visual tension to the image of the art museum, as if it's going to burst apart at the seams. So the space in this painting is completely out of whack, both in color and in form. And this is the Hollywood sign, 1968. It's an 8-color screen print. In the exhibition, there's an artist proof of this work. It's not a painting, it's a print. Ruscha has made just a few paintings of this subject, even though it's closely identified with him. Most of the Hollywood sign images are prints, as this one is. It's a multiple, like a movie. If there are 100 prints in an edition, number 99 in the edition is effectively the same as number 36, which is fundamentally no different from number 87 or from number 12. So it's like a movie that's playing at a Cineplex in Miami, as well as one in Minneapolis and one in Phoenix, Arizona. Which one is the original, or are they all the same? The image has an extreme horizontality like the city. It's a billboard shape for what is in effect a billboard. The Hollywood sign was erected between 1922 and 1923 as a real estate advertisement for a housing development in Hollywood. I'm showing you this because it refers to what I think is probably the key factor, or at least one of them, in Ed Ruscha's biography. In 1956, he was living in Oklahoma City, having moved there with his family when he was just 4 years old. His father was an insurance adjuster for the Hartford Insurance Company, and he'd been transferred from Omaha to Oklahoma. As he entered high school, young Ed was thinking of becoming an artist. He didn't quite know what kind, but he knew he would have to leave Oklahoma to succeed at that. So at the age of 19, he packed up his car and got out onto Route 66 and started driving west. Not east toward Chicago and then New York, but west toward Los Angeles. This was odd. New York in 1956 was the newly established global capital of modern art. Paris, Berlin, London, Moscow, the European capitals of modernism were a ruin, staggering back from the catastrophe of World War II. New York is where it was at, home of the so-called New York School and triumphant abstract expressionist painting and sculpture, like those of Pollock and de Kooning. But rather than go east, Ruscha decided to go west to Los Angeles, a city, as we've seen, that couldn't even claim to have its own civic art museum. In some respects, he was just following the path of generations of Midwesterners before him, men and women who were instrumental in the rapid growth of Southern California before and after World War II. The LA suburb of Long Beach, for example, had long since acquired the nickname Iowa by the Sea because of all the Midwesterners who had moved there. If New York was the capital of what was then called high culture, Los Angeles was the fountainhead of mass culture, of the industrialized and profoundly American art of movies, and not too far off into the future, television. LA was the butt of jokes about this cultural standing, which was a prime mover in finally getting the Los Angeles County Museum of Art built. In 1939, just before the war, that soon-to-be powerful New York art critic Clement Greenberg had written a landmark essay to distinguish the new American avant-garde that he was determined to champion from what he believed to be the tired, burned-out European modernism and its old-fashioned American followers. The title of his now famous essay was Avant-Garde and Kitsch. The avant-garde was riding in to rescue society from the depredations of industrial, mass-produced junk, or kitsch. It didn't take too long for these two opposing camps to harden in the American mind into the difference between New York and LA. New York, institutionalized as the home of the adventurous and bohemian avant-garde, as in Frank Lloyd Wright's Guggenheim, and Los Angeles, perceived home of bourgeois, mass-produced kitsch. You probably recognize the one on the right as well. By moving west rather than east, Ruscha was driving straight into the belly of the beast. He plainly understood what he was doing. A dozen years after he arrived on the West Coast and had begun to taste some success as an artist, he made this drawing. It's an illusionistic rendering of an abbreviation of the name of the state where he had come from, Oklahoma. It's made to look like it's been assembled in 3 dimensions from rolled up sheets of paper. In other words, it's an actual drawing on a sheet of paper made from an illusionistic drawing of sheets of paper. And the letters that form the state's abbreviation, when read out loud, give it a whole new twist. OK, LA. It describes the journey that the artist had taken from Oklahoma to Los Angeles, and it asserts that the destination at which he arrived is just fine. OK, LA, period. It's also worth noting that this drawing was not made of graphite, chalk, or pastel, the traditional mediums for works of graphic art. The drawing is instead made from a very unusual substance. The drawing is made from gunpowder. That makes a lot of sense. The artistic sentiments it was espousing in 1968 were indeed explosive. OK, LA, period. Autobiography lurks inside a lot of Ruscha's art. This is one of the earliest drawings in a very large body of work that he's made over a career that now spans 60 years. It features 8 splashes of bright green ink in 2 rows over 4 splashes of blue ink. They're penned inside a ruled square box, while beneath them is a kind of caption in printed letterpress text. The caption says, "Sweetwater." In a way, sweet water could be considered a pretty nice description of the lovely liquid color framed above the word. The small drawing was related to a large painting, also called Sweetwater, that was accidentally destroyed several years later. We only know it today from this black and white photograph. You can see that it consisted of gestural brushstrokes of oil paint across the top of a relatively large canvas, 5 feet tall, 4 feet wide. And kept very good records of all of his work. And I suppose you could see either the drawing or the painting as a kind of abstract landscape with spots of green grass above the fluid suggestion of a blue lake or river. To be more specific, however, Sweetwater is the name of a tiny town in Oklahoma, population 87, which gets its name from the nearby Sweetwater Creek. The town is at the westernmost edge of the state, just at the border with the Texas Panhandle, about 15 minutes north of Route 66. In other words, Ruscha's Sweetwater drawing identifies his westward journey, leaving home behind, while it also goes slightly off the beaten track. And look closely at the map on the right. What is the next city to the west of Sweetwater on Route 66? It's the city that's the site of Ruscha's standard station, Amarillo, Texas. In the painting, you wouldn't know that just from looking at the gas station. After all, it is completely standard. Only the title, the caption to a picture, identifies the place as Amarillo. Now, what we're looking at in these works is the relationship between an actual landscape and an artistic landscape, the relationship between an image and a word. And that relationship is essentially the subject of Ruscha's extended meditation on the famous Hollywood sign in Los Angeles. As long as we're looking at maps, let me show you where Ruscha's studio was in Hollywood for almost 25 years. And Hollywood is where the studio was. It's a place where a lot of these early works were conceived or made, and it's the place where I first met the artist when I moved to Los Angeles in 1979. The building on the right, that's Ed coming out of the front door there. It's a little sort of bungalow court in a small group of stores. If you look at the map on the left, those 3 red dots down at the bottom, the top red dot on the right is where Ed's studio was. The yellow line going through is Santa Monica Boulevard. Santa Monica Boulevard is Route 66. Route 66 becomes Santa Monica Boulevard as it comes into the city, and Route 66 ends at the ocean in Santa Monica. Ed's studio was about a half a block off of Route 66, on Western Avenue. The red dot below it is the studio of his friend Joe Good, another pretty well-known LA artist. Ed had gone to school with Joe in Oklahoma City. If you look to the left of the Joe Good dot, you'll see Paramount Picture Studios. And go farther left again, and there's the third red dot. That was David Hockney's studio on Santa Monica Boulevard. Now, if you go up from there a bit, you'll see the Hollywood Walk of Fame. That's downtown Hollywood, where then Grauman's Chinese Theater was. And if you go up farther in that kind of yellow-green, where that yellow-green area gets cut in, that's where the Hollywood sign is located. So anytime Ed came out of his studio and got in his car to go somewhere or to walk somewhere, you could look up and there was the Hollywood sign. It was part of his everyday routine. Like the map, the actual landscape and the artistic landscape are not the same thing. Now, remember we spoke a little while ago about CinemaScope movies? Ruscha's Hollywood sign takes the next step forward into 1960s movie technology, all the way to Cinerama, a form of movie that was invented to combat the growing popularity of television in the 1960s. If television was the small screen, so the reasoning went, then make the movie screen as big as possible. That's how movies would compete. Some of you may recognize down on the lower right-hand side of this screen, that's the old Indian Hills Theater here in Omaha. It was about 5 or 6 miles east of the museum on Dodge Street, which at one time boasted the largest Cinerama screen in the world, 35 feet tall and 105 feet long. It was constructed in 1962 and finally torn down in 2001. The space odyssey was over. The aspect ratio of Cinerama, which uses not one, but 3 projectors on a humongous screen, is 2.65 to 1. Ruscha's print generally fits that aspect ratio. It's 17 inches tall and 45 inches wide. So in the print, we are seeing his extravagant Hollywood sign the same way we see extravagant Hollywood movies. The sign is also a complete fiction. Here's what the actual Hollywood sign looks like. The print shows a crisp word riding along the ridge of the hills. The actual Hollywood sign does not do that. It's in the hills all right, but it's not on the horizon. The hills are its backdrop. Ruscha colors his hills pitch black, while he makes the sky an exquisite chromatic blaze. It starts at gold along the edge of the horizon line, and it slides up through an array of fiery reds and oranges until it dissipates in smoky grays along the top. These sizzling colors suggest that the time of day is sunrise, except the side we're standing on would be looking northwest. So maybe it's sunset, or maybe it's the dead of night in the middle of the annual periodic fires that sweep through the hills surrounding Los Angeles. The image on the bottom is from the fires this past December. Looking at Ruscha's picture of Hollywood, it's up to you to decide whether he's showing us heaven or hell, the beginning or the end. The wildfires that periodically rage through Los Angeles are perfectly natural occurrences, and for thousands of years they have served an important purpose. They clear away the deadwood and the underbrush and create fertile territory for new growth to begin. I've always wondered whether that aspect of these very scary wildfires, which Ruscha obviously knows about, isn't at least part of the inspiration for his paintings of standard stations on fire, norms on fire, LACMA on fire. He's burning down art and making fertile new artistic ground. Whatever you decide, do know that Ruscha is not like landscape artists of yore. He's not like those California Impressionist painters standing out in a field full of poppies and eucalyptus trees and drawing or painting what he sees. Here's a historic photo of the Hollywood sign as it looked in 1970, about 18 months after Ruscha made the screen print. The actual sign was notoriously a wreck. The sign had gone up in 1922-23 as an advertisement for a real estate development called Hollywoodland, up above Beechwood Canyon, in what were then barren hillsides. By the late 1960s, the last four letters of the word, land, had been torn down, since the real estate development was long over. So Ruscha was not representing what the eye sees in this work. Instead, as he had learned from Jasper Johns, he was depicting what the mind already knows. Hollywood is as much an idea in the American imagination as it is an actual place. One thing that the mind already knows is what I refer to as the power of the American vernacular, and that includes commercial art. From the mid-19th century on, American painters routinely came from the ranks of commercial artists. For every studio practitioner like Albert Bierstadt or Cecilia Beau, a host of silverware designers, banknote engravers, magazine illustrators, newspaper correspondents, and graphic artists painted independently in their spare time. And some of them were really great. Think of artists as different from one another as the illusionist still life painter William Harnett, who made his living as a silver engraver, and the boisterous chronicler of New York slum life, John Sloan, who toiled as an illustrator for newspapers. The old bond between fine and commercial art at the turn of the 19th century is really not surprising. America's national identity was shifting. What had been an agrarian society was becoming industrial, and the population was shifting from rural to urban. Commerce afforded a new mechanism to support artists. There weren't many prestigious state academies to support them, and not to mention any royal or aristocratic patronage. But the stark difference from those European traditions where modern ideas of art were first tussled into being and then established also helped to fix a false dichotomy in American culture. High art and low art emerged as a stubborn hierarchy. Ruscha's art has been instrumental in dismantling it. What we're talking about here is the power of the modern American vernacular, the visual language or dialect spoken by ordinary people. Artists like Harnett and Sloan painted familiar and even ordinary subjects, but they did it in the manner of old master European painting. Ruscha, on the other hand, took the radical step of applying commercial techniques directly to paint on canvas. A vernacular way of seeing, not just a vernacular subject, is a linchpin to his art. He also took another radical step in relation to the most vernacular art form of all. I'm referring to photography. Ruscha was instrumental in changing the way photographs would relate to what the mind already knows about art. In the history of photography since invention in 1839, and right up to the 1960s when Ruscha began to work, easily one of the most prestigious types of camera work was the genre known as street photography. Street photographers take photographs of fleeting moments that may exist outside of a greater narrative. The whole point of street photography is to capture accident and happenstance, unplanned moments in public space. There are scores of wonderful street photographers. These are by Eugene Aucher from the late 19th and early 20th century, photographed mostly on the streets of Paris. These are by Helen Levitt, taken in New York City between the 1930s on the left and the 1950s on the right. And these are by Gary Winogrand, the one on the left taken in Manhattan, the one on the right taken on Hollywood Boulevard, shot right around the time that Ruscha was working in his studio just a few miles away. Now, however different Ache, Levitt, Winogrand, and other street photographers might be from one another in both their subject matter and their style, they virtually all have one thing in common. Street photographers are pedestrians. They are walking in the street with their cameras. Winogrand even celebrates that fact in a very sly way by putting the walk sign in the center of the top of his picture. They're descendants of the French tradition of the artist as flaneur, an emblematic urban explorer who becomes a connoisseur of life on the street. A flaneur is someone who wanders with no purpose, discovering things by accident along the way. And in the case of the street photographer, like Ache, Levitt, or Winogrand, stopping to take a picture of it. But what does a street photographer do in Los Angeles? A new kind of city characterized not by centralization and vertical high-rise, but by horizontal sprawl, in which the pedestrian was rapidly being replaced after World War II by a new city culture based on automobiles. Try being a flaneur on these new colossal streets, and you are putting your life at risk. This is Gary Winogrand again on Hollywood Boulevard in 1964. He's photographed a couple sitting in a convertible with the top down. She is a passenger looking dead ahead, and he behind the wheel, turning to look at the camera and with a bandage on his nose, perhaps a remnant from a street fight or maybe simple plastic surgery. It's a photograph of LA's car culture, but it was taken by a street photographer who was a pedestrian. What Ed Ruscha decided to do with street photography was pretty simple. Ruscha decided to get in the car. This is his famous photo book called Every Building on the Sunset Strip, which was published just 2 years after the Winogrand photograph was taken. It's an accordion fold picture. When it opens up, it's 27 feet long. The photographs in it are black and white, and it's in a silver slipcase. He produced an edition of 400 of these and sold them for $3 a piece. This is how they were made. On the back of on the flatbed of a pickup truck, he mounted a motorized still camera, timed to shoot as the truck drove slowly along Sunset Boulevard for about 1.5 miles. He did it at the crack of dawn, so there wasn't much in the way of traffic or people on the street. Started around, if you know the Sunset Strip, started around Crescent Heights on the eastern end to Doheny on the western end just before Beverly Hills. And he photographed along one side of the street. When he got to Doheny, he turned the car around, drove back, photographed the other side of the street. So there are 2 strips of stills that face each other in the accordion fold. There are north-south views, photographed while traveling east-west. The tradition of street photography was European, but Ruscha made it in a way that reflects a distinctly American experience. Every building on the Sunset Strip is street photography for a city based on automotive rather than pedestrian movement. Now, before I end, I want to leave you with 2 pictures. One by Ruscha and one by the great 18th century Mexican painter, Jose de Paez. I'll let you figure out which is which. When talking about Ruscha's word pictures and his use of language, it's very common to point to conceptual art in the 1960s and Ruscha's relationship to other artists using words. artists like John Baldessari, Bruce Nauman, Lawrence Weiner. I'm not saying that's wrong, but I am saying that there's another tradition to consider, and it's a thoroughly American tradition. That's the one represented in this painting by Paez. A distinctive strain of Latin American art, especially in Mexico, where Ed was a frequent visitor, incorporates text into paintings of images. This is a somewhat extreme example. It's a huge painting. It's 8 feet high and 10 feet wide, nearly a third of it covered in handwriting. It's a very complicated image, divided into various components that are meant to aid in a viewer's understanding of the tenets of Catholicism. Symbols of the Trinity, the cross, souls in purgatory, the incarnation of the Virgin Mary, and more. The complexity is further spelled out and explained in all of that text that's running down the left side of this huge canvas, as well as halfway down the right edge above the kneeling portrait of the donor, and all around the central cartouche. In this painting, the equivalence being made between word and image is stark. As the Bible says in the Gospel of John, in events leading up to the birth of the infant Jesus, quote, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word was made flesh, full of grace and truth." Ruscha was raised in the church, and his father was a very strict Catholic and rather autocratic, according to his son's recounting. In addition to Ed's westward move, this background is, I think, one of the most important features for understanding his work. Although Ed has long been an unbeliever, the existential questions that give rise to faith will be found throughout his work, whether it's the heaven or hell of the Hollywood sign, or the famous Shakespeare quote from Hamlet, said by his uncle Claudius at prayer, "My words fly up, my thoughts remain below. Words without thoughts never to heaven go." So maybe the simplest way to think about Ruscha's work, which sometimes seems to be all over the map, is this. Ed Ruscha does paint things that the mind already knows, but he does it in a way that makes you wonder whether you really know those things after all. The end. Now, I'd be happy to engage questions if anyone has any. Two things. One, let me remind you that there are microphones. If you have a question, wait for the microphone to get to you. And the second, and I think probably the most important thing to remind you is no speeches from the crowd, just questions. Okay? Ask a question. I'm happy to try to answer. Well, this is easy. Okay, thank you. Oh, wait, you found someone? Okay. Naturally, in the last row.
So I'm curious, what attracted you to Ed Ruscha's art in the first place? There are so many great artists in LA. What made him stand out to you?
Well, when I graduated from college, it was 1972, and I had decided that I was going to go to graduate school to study art history. And when I graduated, a professor at the college, the professor who had sort of been my inspiration for studying art in the first place, gave me a graduation present. And it was a very odd little book called 36 Parking Lots in Los Angeles by someone I'd never heard of named Ed Ruscha. And he inscribed in the front of the book, here's hoping you find your space in the parking lot of life. So the minute I arrived in Los Angeles, I looked up Ed. Here in the center on the right.
I don't know too much about all this, but is he still alive, and is he still painting if he is?
Yeah, Ed is alive and kicking. He's, I think, 80 at this point. Let's see, 1937. Yeah, he'll be 81 sometime, or just before Christmas in December of this year. He's 80. He's still, works in his studio every day. His studio is no longer in Hollywood. His studio is out by the beach in Venice in a very large warehouse. He's quite productive. He has a younger brother named Paul who has worked for him for a very long time. Paul paints some of the backgrounds of the paintings that Ed works on. And Ed does a lot of printmaking. He's still, I think that initial exposure to working as a commercial artist, it's sort of in his bones, and he does a lot of prints. Over here we have.
He must have been interviewed a bunch of times, and what did he say about his own art?
What did he say about
his own art when he was interviewed, or when, if you talked with him or other people?
Ed is notoriously taciturn. He's not a chatty guy about these things. He's one of those artists, and I've met a lot of artists like this. He's one of those artists who's more interested in what you have to say about his work than what he has to tell you about his work. I think he's really curious to know where his work takes you. I've formally interviewed him a couple of times, and it's really hard to get a good quote. The quotes in his paintings are fantastic because he's really thought about them and put them down. In conversation, it's a little more difficult. He's a really easygoing, affable, laid-back kind of guy, but he's not, as I say, he's not extremely forthcoming in discussing his work. The actor Steve Martin, comedian Steve Martin, who's also a really interesting collector, has known him for 40 years. And he once told an interviewer who asked that question, said, what's Ed Ruscha really like? You've known him for 40 years. And he said, well, I don't know, I've known Ed for 40 years, but I've known him best just in the last 15 minutes. Because he's fairly, as I say, taciturn. And I think it's interesting, if you go through the exhibition upstairs, one of the things you won't see is any people in his pictures. There are no people in these pictures. They're environments, and the paintings are talking to you. You're the people in his word environments.
Is he shown in a lot of galleries in Los Angeles, and what prices would his paintings bring?
Yeah, he shows with the Gagosian Gallery worldwide, Gagosian Inc., and we can't afford it.
I have a question over here. You had mentioned earlier the question, you mentioned aesthetic autonomy, and it kind of surprised me in a sense because it imagines still that space existing, and this kind of goes back two of the questions. One, what does he see his art being? And the other about the monetary value of the work of art. So in the increasing, like, the way in which we approach art today is more and more about the commodification of the work of art. But I'm wondering if he sees his art in that vein. Does he see, I mean, because you kind of went back.
I'm sorry, can you ask that?
So,
you have to forgive me, I'm partially deaf, so I was going to ask you to repeat.
So I was just wondering if how he sees his work. Is it something that he sees as separate from the commodification of art? Does he see his art as a space that is art, or does he see it as part of the... Did that cut out right there? Sorry.
I think, you know, like most artists, he's obsessed with art. And more obsessed with his own art than anyone else's. But he's also very aware of other art and very interested in other art. I had said to Karen earlier today when I was up in the permanent collection galleries, I almost included in the talk an image of the Kenneth Nolan chevron painting. You may know that painting. It's a big diamond-shaped painting with chevrons of color. That painting's from 1964. At the time, in 1964, the big argument was over, okay, what's going to be the next big thing after abstract expressionism? And Clement Greenberg and others were championing Nolan and Morris Louis and others, Helen Frankenthaler, who were called color field painters. And Nolan's kind of signature motif at the time was that chevron. I really suspect, and I've never asked Ed about this, but I really suspect that part of his attraction to the Standard Station in Amarillo, Texas, is that the gas pumps are Chevron gasoline. The competition for color field painting was pop, and Ed was doing pop-related work. And in the same way that the LA County Museum on Fire is floating around in a giant color field painting, and Ed is burning it down. In 1964, the LA County Museum had done, or rather in 1966, the LA County Museum did a really important show that was organized. Its curator was Clement Greenberg, the critic, and it was called Post-Painterly Abstraction, and included Kenneth Nolan and others. I think there's definitely a competitive sense in that early work, and that competitive sense doesn't really exist anymore because now younger artists are competing with Ed. He's the thing the mind already knows, or thinks it knows, maybe not.
You touched on the question in the 1960s about what is American art, and I'm curious what you say about that question today.
I think it's over. I think the question's over. I think people realize that the question came about at that time for a whole bunch of reasons. Some of them having to do with the social turmoil of the 1960s. And I think also it had to do with something else that was really new in the 60s, and that was international travel. Jet travel became possible in the 1960s. Relatively inexpensive. It could become a middle-class activity to travel. So the world got smaller, people started going places, and among those people who started traveling a lot were artists. Ed went to Europe in, I think, first in 1961 or 62 with his mom, which I think is really nice. And saw a lot of art there. So I think eventually the question of whether there are national characteristics or national traits began to dissipate, and now it's more like there are kind of local influences that you can see in an artist's work, but the work is not about attempting to define a particular place. It's more about trying to understand what one is, where one is.
Thank you so
Oh, we have one waving person, and then this will be the last question, so make it a good one.
Okay.
Pressure's on.
You said that you met Mr. Ruscha in LA, and I was wondering the depth of your personal relationship with him. Like, did you hang out with him, or did you just meet him, or?
I just met him, and I've seen him socially over the years, and through my work at the Times, and before that another newspaper I worked for, I had interviewed him on a couple of occasions. We're social acquaintances as opposed to dinner buddies or anything like that.
Marvelous, absolutely marvelous.
Thank you all.